I consider the value of all of the property in the world that's used to store wealth. So right now, if you're a wealthy individual and you wanted to give money to your grandchildren, you have a number of choices. You can either buy bars of gold, or you can buy ranches. You could buy blocks of Manhattan or buildings. You can buy shares of companies, corporate stocks. You could put money in a savings account and maybe buy sovereign debt or bonds, corporate bonds or other bonds. And when you add up all this stuff, it's like $500 trillion worth of stuff that people use. And the challenge with all these things is, how do I know if I had $1 million today that it would still be worth $1 million 100 years? If money is economic energy, and
Yes.
so I want to have a certain share of economic energy in the civilization, and I want to maintain it for a long time, for generations. So if I buy a city block in Manhattan, it's intuitive that over 200 years, the value of that city block will go up. And if more people move in Manhattan, it'll go up. And so the positives are people move in the city, and I got a share of the economic activity of the city. The negatives are it's going to get taxed by the mayor of Manhattan. There's going to be zoning regulation by the neighborhood zoning board. It's going to get potentially taxed by the state of New York. It might be the politician decides they really want to build Central Park on my block of land, and they just take it from me and they pay me sub-market, or maybe they want to turn my land into an airport or into a port. So you own property, it sounds really good, but you have to fight to maintain that property over 100 years, and your children's children will have to fight to maintain it. If I took $1 million of economic value in 100 years ago and I held it in dollars, the US dollar is expanding about 7% a year for the past 100 years. So if you do the math, you find that you lose 99% of the economic value in cash. And that's why nobody in their right mind would put $1 million of cash in a box and put a time lock on it, and in the year 2120 expect their great-grandchildren to open the box and for it to be worth anything. It will be worth nothing.
Sure.
If I put $1 million of gold in a box, 100 years from now, the challenge is, will the bank or the government seize the gold? Pretty much every country on earth stole everybody's gold over the last 100 years. If you had it in Germany, it got stolen multiple times. The British, the French, the Japanese, the Russians, even the Americans stole everybody's gold. And if it didn't get stolen, that's what we call counterparty risk. Seizure, confiscation. If it didn't get stolen, if you increase the gold supply by 2% a year, then you realize the half-life of money in gold, that seems the half-life of energy in a battery. You couldn't move $1 million of gold through an airport, but it's more portable than a building. You're not moving your building out of LA ever. So you've got this conundrum, which is things that hold their value for a long time, like soccer teams or football teams, maybe. They have cultural risk. Will people still want to watch football and soccer in 100 years? And they're not so portable, and they're very political. Then you have things that look straightforward, like owning 1,000 acres of land. But if your enemy takes over as governor of the state, they just pass a property tax, so they tax your land away from you. And then the oldest cliche is, lost the family farm because we couldn't pay the property taxes. When you think of it as digital gold, then it should replace gold. Gold's worth $10 trillion, and that takes Bitcoin to 500,000. But when you think of it as digital property, like replacing buildings and land and other long storeholds of wealth, then, you're up by a factor of 20 or 30 from there. It should not be. It's much better than digital gold because I can move Bitcoin at the speed of light, and I can program it to 1 million transactions an hour on an iPhone or a website. You can't do that with gold. So it's got more utility than gold, which means it's probably worth 20 or 30 trillion if it just replaces the gold. But instead of buying the Fontainebleau Hotel, which is a nice hotel worth whatever billions in Miami Beach, instead of buying that, instead of buying the equivalent amount of Bitcoin, If you bought the Bitcoin, you can move that to any city in the world every hour of the day, compose it, decompose it, recompose it, dematerialize it. And when there's a nasty tax on it, you can just move yourself to a different jurisdiction where there's a better tax treatment. And if you think of it like that, then it's a multi-$100 trillion asset class. At 10 trillion is 500,000, at 100 trillion is 5 million. So I think we're marching toward $10 trillion, which is, $10 million a coin, which is why Bitcoin enthusiasts see it's just a very great long-term store of value. And it's a great investment idea because it meets the needs of 8 billion people. The average person, the middle-class person that drives an Uber or works as a dentist, they can't buy $387 worth of a building in New York City every month is their savings plan. A person in Africa can't buy a small share of a nice piece of property. They can't buy $127 worth of a Picasso painting. So Bitcoin offers property rights at any scale, any amount of money, anybody in the world. And you don't have to worry about, will people like Picassos? Will they still want buildings in Vegas or New York? Will some politician tax it away from me? Well, can I take it through an airport? If you're looking for an egalitarian, utilitarian way for people to save money and protect their life force or protect their economic wealth for the next 100 years, and you are looking for something that's consistent with the mobile wave, Android phones, iPhones, websites, that's truly global, it's more appealing to people in Nigeria and Argentina than it is appealing to people. Before we move to outer space, we will move to cyberspace.
Yes, I agree with
you.
So
the next big move is, how about if we give property rights and we make rich 8 billion people in the real world by moving their wealth into cyberspace where it will be protected from debasement and destruction.
I love that. I love that vision.
Like when you put stuff in orbit, when you're putting in outer space, I put 1 million pounds in orbit and I can move it around and it'll go in orbit forever. That's the breakthrough. But when I put $1 billion in cyberspace, I'm putting $1 billion in orbit, it'll last forever. Right now, the half-life of your money is 7 years or something. So the next big move is fix the energy, the political economic energy system in our civilization. Because by my calculation, we're wasting somewhere in the order of $10, $20 trillion a year because our economics are broken. And so what could you do if I gave you 10 trillion a year in a dividend to work on science? Right, so there's no point in losing 10 trillion a year every year for the next 30 years while we try to do something scientific, because we're just bleeding out. It's back to the issue of stop the bleeding before. I'm not getting a PhD while I'm bleeding to death on the sidewalk. John D. Rockefeller lived to the age 99 3/4, 99, almost 100. And he's famously known for having set up the entire modern American medical system, maybe the medical system of the world, and endowing doctors and the like. But he famously rejected all medical care. He was homeopathic, and his view was a lot of the doctors were quacks, and many of the drugs and the surgeries were iatrogenic. His thoughts are echoed by Upton Sinclair, who wrote The Fasting Cure more than 100 years ago, where he basically observed that most diagnoses, most drugs, most surgeries were counterproductive, and the best thing you could do when you're sick is just stop eating for a while. And he wrote an entire book about it in 1910. When I think about health and I observe what we've learned over the past few years, or however long it is, it's healthy living, right? So think about, I'm inspired by Paleolithic, the entire paleo theory. How did human beings live for 3 million years as hunter-gatherers? And ask the question, 100,000 years ago, did your great ex-grandfather or grandmother do the thing you're about to do? And if the answer is drink large, copious amounts of alcohol, pure sugar, take lots of pharmaceutical drugs, have your stomach stapled, right, and have other random surgeries, probably not, or sit on a chair and watch TV. But if you say to yourself, get up, move around, get exercise, eat lean proteins, eat a mixture of organic foods, drink water, right? Probably they did that. And so I tend to be skeptical of a lot of medical intervention. I think that the modern establishment invents a lot of diseases so they can treat them. Like they want to tell you that your 6-year-old kid has attention deficit disorder so they can give them Adderall. But we didn't have Adderall growing up, and we didn't take it, and we got on just fine. And maybe getting bored of things that are boring is a positive trait and not a negative trait. Bitcoin itself ultimately is about creating a truthful ledger, and I've talked about it. It is energy in cyberspace. It's encrypted energy. What you're doing is you're taking electricity, you're running it through a SHA-256 modulation, and you're spitting out a block of Bitcoin, which is encrypted, and then you're putting successive layers of encryption on the blocks over time, and which represent reified energy, right, or reified information. And so I describe it as like a fire in cyberspace. You can think of it as a fire, a chain reaction in cyberspace, but you could also think of a swarm creature as very organic.
Yes.
Because it's just an organically evolving thing. And if you roll the clock back 13 years, it was just a few cypherpunks working on it, and then it picked up power.